The Rebel Capitalist Show.
Yeah, I'm assuming that you had Russia on a watch list prior to the invasion. I can't, it was on the Thursday or whatever. And so what prevented you from investing when like Lukoil and Spurbank and Gazprom, I'm sure a lot of businesses that you follow very closely, when they were really taking a haircut, they're getting super cheap, but obviously not as cheap as they are now with everything frozen. So what made you, why were you patient? What made you disciplined there?
Well, I didn't buy any of those shares because I just didn't think it was enough panic yet. It turned out I was right, and so for once, it's a good thing I didn't work. I didn't do something, and now I cannot do something. Some of those stocks are just unbelievably cheap. Unless Russia is going to disappear, which is unlikely, some of these things would be great buys if we could buy them. But I don't even think the Russians can buy these stocks now. I know they cannot in Moscow.
Yeah. So have you seen something like this happen before? What time in your investing career have you seen something similar to this, and what was it?
Well, I would just go back and say, and by the way, George, it's not always good to invest. I said before, if you have the staying power and you can do it, you will make a lot of money. But if you'd invested in Cuba in 1960, you'd still be waiting. So don't think it's always that easy. We've had wars and problems before. I remember when Japan had a tsunami back in 2011.
Yeah.
I was already buying Japan, and then the tsunami hit, and I bought a lot more to my delight and shock. And, the market quadrupled in the next few years. It's not quite the same as the war that we're seeing now. I cannot remember, it's just because I'm not thinking about it, war situations like this, with which have presented markets and presented opportunities in a big market. Iraq was a war, but there was basically no market. So you have to find a place that has a market, a viable market, and a disaster. The Asians, who've been around longer than we have a word that means, what it means is opportunity and disaster are the same thing.
Right.
It's interesting. The Chinese character, the Korean character, and the Japanese character are all exactly the same. They're pronounced differently, obviously, but they all mean opportunity and disaster are together.
So how are you personally playing it from here moving forward? Like, what would be the catalyst? I know that we've talked about this several times, and this is the conclusion that Jesse and I actually came to, and we were thinking through what would Jim Rogers do right now. We said he'd probably be hyper focused on Russia, but he probably wouldn't have pulled the trigger. He'd probably be waiting for a catalyst for some sort of change to give you the green light. So what are you intently focused on when there is that catalyst?
I don't think it's possible to invest in many things, if any things, in the Russian financial markets right now. Certainly not outside of Russia, not inside Russia either, or if it's possible, maybe outside Russia. The catalyst would be that it opens, and since I would be a little cautious, the catalyst would be, well, it opens, and then I would watch to see what happens. If it opens and everything totally collapses, that would be a signal that I should be buying.
And then what if it does the opposite? What if it opens and it just skyrockets?
Well, I'd say, well, I had a good idea, but I was a fool. I didn't do anything. But it would depend, when they open and they skyrocket, usually for a few minutes, if you're there and alert, you can do something. Obviously, if you're late, you're late and you miss it. No, nothing you can do. I don't want to buy something when it's skyrocketing unless I'm in at the beginning of the skyrocket.
Yeah. I went back and reviewed some of the, the stuff, some of the trades that you made, or the investments, I should say, back in the 1980s that I thought was kind of applicable to this, from the standpoint of you actually didn't pull the trigger because you thought they may just close the market. They thought they may take your shares. One that came to mind was, I believe, Japan in 1990 when they collapsed, or maybe it was in the late 80s, you're thinking about shorting Japan, but you're hesitant because you thought they may change the rules. I think that was your specific line. And you use the example of the Kuwait stock market in 1981 or 1982, when they were allowing people to buy shares with post-dated stocks or post-dated checks, excuse me. And you said that you wanted to short that so bad, but you didn't because you knew that the government would do something to where you couldn't get your money back. And so that kind of reminded me of what we're seeing play out in Russia today.
Well, they always, not always, but the governments frequently change the rules. On the Kuwait example was a very good example. They especially would change the rules if they wanted to, but it's a risk anywhere. For instance, now Russia's changed the rules. They closed the market.
Yeah.
They make it impossible to buy and sell anything. You can't even buy government bonds. Foreigners cannot buy government bonds, and Russians can't either, because everything is closed. They do change the rules. I've seen many times they change the rules. You remember the Hunt brothers back in, maybe you remember when they were shorting, they were buying silver, and then the exchange changed the rules to protect the members. You know, exchanges aren't supposed, they're supposed to protect the customers, but in Chicago, they protected the members, and the Hunts went bankrupt because they changed the rules on them. You always have to be careful of that, especially if it's a country, because countries, not always, but very frequently will change the rules. So one has to watch out.
How do you hedge that? Just through position size, or is there some other way?
I don't know anyway. You just have to know. I have enough experience or read enough to know that, okay, if they change the rules, what do I do?
Right.
And the Hunts, who didn't have much experience, there was nothing they could do because the exchange had more power than they did. And the exchange changed the rules to protect the members. The members were all shorting to the Hunts. The Hunts had a lot of money in those days and a lot of margin power. And I certainly did not know that they were going to change the rules in those days. But if they want, you always have to be aware, if you're investing in something that's moving a lot or a disaster, somebody will or could change the rules.
Right, right.
It's not fair. It should not happen. It's not the way the world is supposed to work. So call your congressman.
Yeah. So now you touched on a point there that I wanted to bring up. You're saying, with your reading, and now, we've got the media, and there is just so much propaganda in the West. I don't know if you're staying current with the Western media because you're in Singapore, but it's just, it just seems obnoxious at times. But I know that there's an equal amount of propaganda probably on the Russian side. So how, in your career of investing, how do you sift through the propaganda to try to find the truth as to what's actually happening?
It is an extremely insightful question, and I'm delighted you asked it. But I tell my daughters, who I'm trying to teach how to live in the world, I tell them, try to read or listen to 4 or 5 sources from 4 or 5 different countries, because every country tells you the truth. They think they're telling you the truth. But the problem is, if you listen to 5 different countries, it cannot all be the truth. So and I do it myself. This is why I try to teach my children. You have to listen to the sources from everywhere, and then you still might not get it right. Then you have to put it in your poor brain and turn it around and figure out what's really happening, especially in war. I'm not the first person to know that. What was the saying? Truth is the first casualty of war. Yeah. Even the Greeks knew that thousands of years ago. American senator said that in the First World War. Truth is the first casualty of war. So at least if you know that, you got a leg up, because then you will realize, okay, now we have to figure out what's really happening. And that requires listening to stories from everywhere. You listen to the Russian side, the Ukrainian side, the American side. They're all they all tell you a different story.
I know you were following geopolitics quite a bit back in the 90s. I would assume when kind of the Soviet Union fell and the Berlin Wall came down. And I think that was about that was when NATO was formed, I believe, when the Soviet Union crumbled. So what was your impression of NATO back in the 90s or the late 90s? And did you ever think that they would play a part in what we're seeing today? Were you hesitant? Were you a little bit worried back then that that it might not go well, that Russia might push back?
A slight correction. No, NATO was formed after the Second World War, not in the when the Berlin Wall fell.
Okay.
When the Berlin Wall fell, they started expanding to some of the Central European countries. No, well, when the Berlin Wall fell, everybody was excited and delighted. I was looking for investments. I started making small investments in Central Europe and Russia because, I mean, Russia is a gigantic country with huge assets. I mean, it's been abysmally managed for a lot of its history, but there were and are opportunities whenever something falls apart. It's, as I say again, if you can invest in a disaster, you're probably going to make a lot of money if you have the staying power. It's not that easy. I repeat the Cuban example. If it was a disaster, we'd still be waiting. North Korea, you would still be waiting. So it's not that simple.
Yeah, but I think the key goes back to not only finding panic and buying panic, but also waiting to buy panic once there is a significant catalyst. That's really the key.
Absolutely. I went to Venezuela sometime during last year, during the total collapse. Went down, and it was a total collapse. But then America said, sanctions, you cannot invest in Venezuela. So even then, the Venezuelans didn't change the rules. They love for somebody to come and invest. But America said, no, you cannot invest there.
Yeah.
And we're citizens of the land of the free, George. We're not so free sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. But now it's, the United States is trying to get Venezuela to produce more oil to make up for the sanctions against Russia. It's just amazing how the politicians are so hypocritical.
These guys, exactly, hypocritical. I'm sure there's a worse word than that to describe these guys. They've been shrieking about Venezuela for a long time, doing everything they can to punish them. And now they're saying, oh, hello, Venezuela.
Russ.
Got any oil?
Yeah, exactly.